Hi, hello. Every couple months I go through what I call a nuclear phase, where I get really interested in the history of atomic testing.
Tautonymph.
This one was inspired by a reread of Ellen Meloy's The Last Cheater's Waltz. No, I lost a post-it note. Ellen Meloy changed my life just about 2 years ago when I started reading Eating Stone, which is a book I think about every single day. It got me really interested in bighorn sheep. I named my cat Ovis in honor of the genus. I made a character called Caprini that's like a human-goat hybrid. And just 2 weeks ago for Halloween, I went as Alexander from Where the Wild Things Are, who is the goat monster from the movie, which is actually a very scary movie, not really a kid's movie. But in any case, I wanted to go through this book because I didn't really love it on my first read, which was also almost 2 years ago. So now I'm looking at it with fresh eyes and a renewed interest in nuclear history. So the plot of this book is that Ellen and her husband buy a tract of land in southeast Utah where they plan to build their home. The book opens and Ellen accidentally pours her coffee into a cup in which there was a lizard, and the lizard is boiled alive, and she's like, damn, I'm supposed to be connecting with this land, and now I just killed one of its inhabitants. She opens up her art box and finds a map, like a topographic relief map, and she's like, oh, I should actually make my own map, like a home map to really understand the land. So I guess the thesis is kind of, the silent chemistry of this desert lay deep within me. To re-inhabit my own body, I had to traverse again and again the desert's cruel and beautiful skin. If you haven't read Meloy's work before, it's almost all focused on the desert. She loves the desert. At the time of writing this, she had been living intermittently and working in the desert for like 20 years. So now that she's moving there full time, she wants to get a super intimate look at the land. Where this book starts to intersect with nuclear history is pretty immediate. She gets in her car and drives through the Say Valley, also known as Monument Valley, which is this really gorgeous, picturesque desert landscape with buttes and mesas. The title of this portion of the book is Alien Pebbles, because in the early 20th century, maybe even late 19th century, mining efforts were undertook in this region to extract radioactive materials from the ore to create consumer products. Think those illuminescent wristwatches and paints and things like that. Just one state over, technically the Four Corners, saw the first nuclear detonation ever. This was the Trinity test on July 16th, 1945. As Meloy writes, the Trinity test spawned the primary death anxiety of the rest of all time. And I totally agree with that. Part of this nuclear phase I lock into every couple months is because I am really truly terrified about the use of nuclear weapons, even though I feel like right now AI is kind of outcompeting that anxiety. But truly, at least on a weekly basis, I'll be walking down the street or driving or something, and in my mind's eye, I just see a giant white flash that envelops my entire periphery, and I have to think fuck, I'm gonna die in a nuclear explosion. Ellen's love of the desert and writing of this book is kind of a response to the reasons that scientists chose this ecosystem to test their first atomic weapons. So she highlights 3 key factors that makes desert an ideal testing ground. First is its isolation. So these top secret projects like the Manhattan Project weren't going to intersect with civilian life. 2, the relatively uninhabited nature of the desert, although Meloy points out that indigenous people were really highly affected by nuclear tests. I mean, even today there's like groundwater contamination. There are large swaths of desert that can't be accessed at all because of residual radiation, as well as people being forcibly removed from their lands, which goes back hundreds of years in the history of the United States. Later on in the mid-century, Marshall Islanders faced the same horror of being dispossessed of their land, forcibly relocated onto islands that were not big enough to sustain the health of their communities, and then also burdened with the health effects of being irradiated. And 3, the relative stability of the desert environment. If I can remember back to some of my geography classes in college, deserts kind of exist in bands of high pressure on the planet, so there's not a lot of like uplift and evaporation that causes rain. And also visibility. Because there's not a lot of weather, you can see straight for miles. It's also interesting to note that it wasn't only the American deserts that were testing grounds for atomic weapons, but also globally. So the UK tested nuclear weapons. I know they did on some Pacific islands, but also in the deserts of Australia. India tested nukes in their deserts, as well as China testing in, I think, the Gobi Desert. The day of the Trinity test was predicted to maybe receive inclement weather. There had been storms earlier in the week, which kind of brings us to the title of the book, The Last Cheater's Waltz. So when I Googled Last Cheater's Waltz, I was expecting to find Ellen Meloy resources, because my world revolves around her, but evidently the rest of the universe does not, unfortunately. So the first thing that came up was a song by like a country artist called Sonny Throckmorton. And I looked at the lyrics, I listened to the song. It didn't really have anything to do with nuclear testing directly. However, the singer Sonny Throckmorton was born in Carlsbad, New Mexico. When I did some research on Wikipedia, I didn't find any like direct links between him and atomic testing. However, Carlsbad did petition for a nuclear waste holding facility to be built in their subterranean salt mines. And that project was approved in 1999, which coincidentally is the same year that this book was published. It is said that Robert Oppenheimer was listening to a Tchaikovsky waltz the moment the Trinity test went off. One of the reasons I love Ellen Meloy so much is that she intertwines nature with humanity so beautifully. The storm that rolled in earlier in the week of the Trinity tests awoke these dormant spadefoot toads that estivate during the hottest months of the year and emerge during rainy season to spawn in ephemeral puddles. And she gives like a whole ecology of the desert spadefoots. I learned the word amplexus, which is the mating embrace of toads, or toads, frogs, amphibians, as well as horseshoe crabs, which are my favorite animal. And it's just like the male grabbing the back of the female. The soundtrack for the ultimate evolutionary moment of this century, to which nothing on Earth would be immune, could not have been stranger. A Tchaikovsky waltz and small pockets of air pushed through hundreds of ballooning throats. In order to find each other in the giant expanse of desert, they vocalize a really high, whiny, like ribbit. I got a pretty good baseline understanding of atomic weapons from this book. Uranium is a naturally occurring element, whereas plutonium is synthesized from the enrichment of uranium, I think, by bombarding it with neutrons to make it heavier. The bomb dropped on Hiroshima contained a uranium core, which was ignited by sort of like a shooting, like a gun of like uranium and uranium like hitting, whereas the bomb that was dropped on Nagasaki was plutonium, and it was exploded by bombardment from all sides by neutrons, like a big pressure cooker that made it implode. So I printed out some visual aids at the library. So this whole perimeter here is the area of the White Sands Missile Range, which is the giant military testing facility. Here is the Trinity site where the world's first atomic bomb was detonated. And here is White Sands National Monument, which is open to the public, and it's a really gorgeous desert landscape, which I have not been to yet. The closest I've been to the desert was on a trip to Colorado this summer. Outside of the Denver airport, there is this refuge called the Rocky Mountain Arsenal something. This place is so pretty. It's giving me sort of like scratching that itch of visiting a desert. I'm gonna do more research on this location when I get home. My friend thinks it used to be used for nuclear testing or something similar, which is why it's called the Arsenal Range. Look at this. They have a black-footed ferret exhibit. And it used to be a chemical weapons testing facility. It was so contaminated with chemicals that I believe it was like the biggest remediation ever, the biggest remediation effort in American history, just like digging up tons and tons of soil and replacing it. And also I found this really interesting article that man-made earthquakes were caused at the site as the military injected waste into the lithosphere for some sort of disposal. But because this whole site, the White Sands Missile Range, is off limits to civilians and visitors, it paradoxically preserves so much of this unique desert ecosystem. I didn't highlight this part in the book, but Ellen writes about how White Sands preserves like a very unique desert bestiary, and lately I've just been obsessed with that word, like bestiary. I think in another one of her works, she writes you should create a local bestiary or something like that. I just love the word bestiary. For all my Eating Stone fans out there, this book was published before Eating Stone, like 5 or 6 years prior, and it's really interesting to see Ellen's fascination with the bighorn sheep that live in the region develop throughout this work. She mentions a favorite character of mine, San Andres U067, who is the last remaining native desert bighorn sheep in the San Andres mountain range. Ellen's visceral disgust at the history of atomic testing paradoxically leads her to learning more about it. And I mean, I guess I am suffering the same affliction. There's something to be said about Ellen's generation of environmental activists in the 1990s that I think has been totally lost. I really feel like that was the environmental tipping point, at least in terms of like human lifespan. The work that 90s environmentalists were trying to do to like reduce carbon emissions and put in stops on pesticide use and GMO foods and chemicals, as well as plastics, can never be turned around. Like we really have just gone completely off the edge of a cliff, and it's really hard to envision, like, not to be like we live in a society, but it's really hard to like envision life without these things. Like I actually don't think it's possible, and it is a cause of green fatigue if I think about it too much. I love this scene. I think it's really emblematic of Ellen's ability to make these really astute observations, which carry a lot of meaning, but also poke fun at herself and imbue some humor in the work. I brought my lunch, which I made in Santa Fe before I departed for Trinity at dawn, and which is now radioactive, stashed bravely in the pockets of my off-the-charts radioactive day pack, which sits on the floor beside my plutonium-encrusted shoes. I pull out a sandwich, a pathetic polygon of bread spread with some sort of new age substance, and stare down at it. I feel a sudden aggressive benevolence towards everyone in this room, as if I could somehow set the world straight merely by goodwill, by doing the right thing, by being extremely nice to people. Instead, I continue to stare stupidly at my lunch. Even here, she's reckoning with there being no possibility of change. And I must say, I do like the idea of a sandwich with some sort of new age substance spread over it. When I was in middle school, in like 2010, I went vegetarian for the first time. Maybe even earlier in elementary school I tried. And that lasted for a couple months, then I stopped. Then in 2011, I went vegetarian. Then in 2013, I went vegan, and I was a vegan until 2019. So a lot of my early meatless recipes were like new age substances. I found so many resources online, and I have a really soft spot in my heart for like 70s new age vegetarian culture. Like every meal involving sprouts and chickpeas, which is probably why I've recently developed an obsession with the Heaven's Gate cult. Even though they weren't vegetarians, they were super new age, of course. Like their whole belief system was predicated on a spacecraft coming down to pick them up to take them to the next level. And their whole ethos was about trying not to be human. So strong differences in gender variation were discouraged. So men had to like speak in a higher voice, and women had short haircuts, and they all dressed in like this unisex, not outfit, like if you've seen the Heaven's Gate crime scene photos, they didn't walk around in those cloaks, but they were super like normcore Old Navy. In any case, now we get to part 2 of the book. Part 1 of the book gave a foundation for understanding the story of nuclear testing and why that is impactful for Ellen's life. Part 2 of the book is when Ellen actually finds radioactive material on her land. She digs up a vibrant piece of yellow cake, which is carnotite, the ore that contains naturally occurring uranium, and she freaks out. In order to better understand it, she travels to the Nuclear Museum at Los Alamos. This is the site where the scientists and personnel working on the Manhattan Project lived for several years. After I read this book, I read another one called Atomic Doctors by somebody Nolan, and he sort of chronicles his grandfather's involvement in the Manhattan Project. And he was like the lead doctor and safety expert on radiation in Los Alamos, and also ferried the bomb little boy across the Pacific to be dropped on Hiroshima. There's a lot to say on the blatant ignorance of Army officials during this time, who completely disregarded the lives of scientists, civilians, and honestly themselves in the pursuit of developing this weapon. Part of the lore of Los Alamos is that the desert, aside from the factors I mentioned earlier that make it suitable for a nuclear testing site, Los Alamos was chosen because Robert Oppenheimer loved the desert. One of the smartest lines in this book is when Ellen's talking about this history and how people would also come to the desert, like Robert Oppenheimer, for like a spiritual and physical healing. Think like Victorian doctors prescribing women to go to the seaside to cure their hysteria. And she writes, "A lot of sick people have come here." I just think that's so brilliant. Like the literal those with physical infirmities, as well as the people who developed nuclear weapons, who Ellen obviously thinks are evildoers for the callous disregard of human and general life. She hears of a nuclear surplus store in the area, and she wants to visit it. So she asks one of the docents at the museum where she can find it. "Are you sure you want to go to the black hole? You want to talk to Ed?" "Who is Ed?" I asked. "Ed Grothis. He owns the Los Alamos sales company, the Black Hole." "Are you alone? Do you plan to go there by yourself?" "Is this Ed some kind of pervert?" I ventured. What could be worse than this hamlet of denial? Homeless people? Brie vendors? Democrats? She gave me another pensive frown. "Oh no, he's a gentleman. He... ... She paused, then blurted it out. "He writes letters." To the editor. Is the black hole safe? Is it radioactive? No, she replied to my second question. Ed just collects surplus hardware from the lab. Her frown deepened. Then she leaned closer, ready to blister into my brain the horrific, naked truth. She handed me the map and gave me a stern look. He's a communist. Another great line I haven't been able to stop thinking about is, why oh why, I moaned. Was I taking the entire nuclear age personally? I think that's so emblematic of like this whole book. It's her sending herself into this horrible and paranoid state, trying to learn how toxic the land that she's living on is. And I so relate to that. I mean, why oh why was I taking the entire AI revolution personally? Why oh why, I moaned, was I taking my boss being annoyed at something that doesn't even have to do with me personally? And I guess that's why I relate to Ellen so much, and like her writing is so important to me, because I feel like I have like very similar mental structure to her. I don't know, just this like anxious, frenetic desire to be like lonely, but also wanting to know the meaning of everything so deeply. She lives in Utah, so there's not really bars, but she drives all this distance, she finds a bar, and she sits down with a geologist friend because she still hasn't like ascertained much about this yellow cake rock that she's carrying around. So she brings it into the bar, and I also think it's interesting that she believes she has dangerous radioactive material, and she's just like ferrying it around with her, like bare hands. So she brings it into the bar, and her geologist friend sort of laughs, and he's like, this is asphalt painted with yellow paint. Like, it was a street. And again, it just goes back to her like creating this awful paranoid situation for really there to be nothing there to be concerned about. A boiled lizard inspired me to cross that frontier and deepen the knowledge. When I did, I precipitated not resurrection, but a collapse of faith. Was I on the verge of an apostasy of place? The malaise of soul, so pervasive when I created its antidote, the map, seemed incurable. The world hardened with the very antithesis of the sensual. Underground pods of poison, vast tracts of nature preserved not by love, but by the instruments of war. Public rooms bursting with technology's glory, and not a word, not a whisper. Out here in the red-bone desert, I once thought the human voice seemed less consequential than in other places. At best, a remote echo of intellectual asceticism. Now it was the only voice I heard, the desert itself an accomplice to betrayal. So Ellen wants to get rid of this piece of yellow cake, which is not yellow cake. She brings it to the site of Project Gas Buggy, and I am so interested in this history. Okay, so after the development of nuclear weapons, after they were used in Japan, after they were tested in the Marshall Islands, the US had a giant stockpile of these bombs, and they didn't know what to do with them. So enter Project Plowshare, which was investigating civilian uses of atomic weapons for infrastructure projects. I listened to a podcast about this one proposed project in Alaska, 1961, where they were gonna nuke a bay to create a new harbor, which is like so crazy, and it only didn't happen because there was a native tribe that opposed the detonation of a nuke on their land. So the Atomic Energy Commission sent all these scientists to study like what would happen and what would be affected. And this was actually the birth of the environmental impact assessment. The Plowshare site that Ellen brings her rock to is called Project Gas Buggy. And they detonated a subterranean nuclear weapon to release natural gas trapped in the strata. Think fracking, but with a nuke. It turned out to be not successful, and also the gas would probably be radioactive. So imagine having radioactive gas like piped into your stove and then burning in your home. I haven't been able to find a book about Project Plowshare specifically, but I did finally find a copy of Eileen Wellsum's The Plutonium Files that was under $40. I've been looking online for the past 2 weeks There's only one copy in the New York City public library system, but it's on reserve, so you can only go to use it as a research instrument. You can't actually take the book out yourself. I asked at like 3 bookstores. I've been checking thrift books and eBay, and one finally popped up on eBay for $16. So I was like, yes, please. Which also sucks that it's so hard to find, because that was going to be the first title in the book club I want to start on my Patreon. But if I'm the one running the book club, and I can't even find the book that I want to read, then how can I expect other people to find it? So our story ends with Ellen reckoning with everything she's learned, in sort of having her working thesis broken a little bit, because this yellow cake isn't even yellow cake. Her map of the known universe has been filled out, and she wants to get rid of it. So she goes to the top of this hill, and she is planning to like throw it into a pile of uranium tailings that she sees, which is like the spent rocks that were processed for their uranium. She gets vertigo, and then she falls, and she drops the map. And this is one of the most beautiful things that she's ever written, which is really hard to choose. The pinyon jays had returned. The sound of their cries was like the desert itself, edged, wild, and so familiar I could hardly bear them. In a single moment, the birds pitched me into a chasm of deepest aching sorrow. Sorrow because what I knew broke my heart. Someday, maybe today, if I fell off the cliff or lightning struck me, I would leave it all those glorious ways to feel the world, the hearing, smelling, seeing, touching, loving, and wondering, would end in nothing. She has these lines in all of her books about her own mortality, which make me so sad, because she died in 2004. Eating Stone was published posthumously, and she has lines in there too about like sort of like the absence after death. There's one more scene at the very end of the book where she attends the 50-year anniversary of the Trinity test. So that would be in like 1995. And while she's there, she's confronted with a Japanese man who's also there. And they have this like unspoken conversation with their eyes of just like the horror of what happened. Following The Last Cheater's Waltz, I read Atomic Doctors. And then I read John Hersey's Hiroshima, which is like the seminal text on the aftermath of the atomic bomb. It follows like 5 or 6 people who experienced the impact that day. And just the scenes of what happened immediately after. So the bomb was dropped, there was a giant flash of light, thousands of people were like immediately vaporized, or if they were unlucky enough to be like within a certain range where they lived, they got horrible radiation sickness, like skin swelling and falling off, vomiting, death within the day, if not the month. There's this scene where all of the survivors head to a park, and it's like a beacon of life because everything in the city is destroyed, like buildings leveled, there's fires breaking out. So they're in this park, and I learned that Hiroshima is sort of built on like the delta of 7 rivers, and they're tidal rivers. So there are people hiding in the waters, and there's this one man who's ferrying people, like really sick and injured people, to the bank of the river because it's safe there. And then he goes up and down the river, like paddling, like with a stick. And then when they wake up in the morning, the tide had come in and all of those people drowned. And then within that same scenario in the park, all of these fires that broke out cause so much convection that there's like wind gusts that are so strong that they cause a water spout over the river. Like, it's crazy and it's horrific. And the other story that really sticks with me is the one of the priest, Father Kleinsborg or something. He's this German priest who lives in like one of the Catholic churches in Hiroshima. and he's trying to offer people water who are so incredibly thirsty. And he comes upon this like platoon of soldiers who are like moments from death. Their eyes have melted out of their skulls. Their lips are like swollen so far that they can't even open them. And he gives them water through like a piece of bamboo. It's just horrible. And even when I was little, I remember learning about Hiroshima and like something about like some people would drink water and they would just die. Like their bodies couldn't process the water. When I get plutonium files, its premise is these 18 people, patients, who were unknowingly dosed with plutonium by their doctors. But before I wrap up, because I feel like this video is getting pretty long, I would like to just point out a few other parts of the book that I thought were really notable. One of my favorite scenes is when Ellen wakes up and she finds the remains of this rabbit she heard getting tore apart by coyotes in the night. The bunny legs looked so silly there on the ground, with their huge hind feet and leathery toe pads. The ears measured at least 5 inches, silky and tender, brownish with jet black tips. I stroked them, tried them on my own head. I held them up to the sun to see the scarlet translucence of light that passes through delicate mammal ears. That image of her picking up the dismembered ears and trying them on her own head, I mean, it's like so incredible. And I of course like love horns and ears and all sorts of like head accoutrement. That scene just really spoke to me. And something else that I like about Ellen Meloy is that she goes really in depth on like the most random, obscure topics. It's like there's this one part where she's like observing a lizard and she's like talking about the difference in color from like the side scales to like the belly scales, and it's like so engrossing to see her describe these things that are so minuscule that most people wouldn't take note of. And also, like, this is like a gripe that I have with all sorts of popular science media, is they either don't go very in depth or they all sort of pick the same subject and just like talk around the concept. It's like I remember once in Florida, I went to this sort of like a conference they had on like plastic pollution in the city, and it was like a PowerPoint just like why plastic is bad. And then I guess I did learn a little bit about like the numbering system of plastics. Like under a bottle there'll be a number and it sort of tells you if this thing is actually recyclable or not. But there was really no like useful, interesting information. It was just sort of like, plastic pollution is bad, please recycle. And I feel like a lot of popular science is like that. I'm gonna have to think about this more, but it's kind of why I don't like webinars, because a lot of the times, unless it's like a lecture, I feel like there's a difference between a lecture and sort of like a presentation talk where they just discuss like the concept of something or the concept of an issue, but not any intricacies in actuality. I don't know if that makes sense, but Ellen like really gets in there and she talks about everything. And the other thing that I really liked learning about in this book is the history of invasive species in the desert Southwest. So of course there's the native desert bighorn sheep. They were outcompeted and contracted illness from domestic sheep that humans raise for like wool and milk, I guess. I don't know. But there's something, sorry, I'm like getting excited. There's like something so cool. There's something so cool about, not even cool, because I mean, I don't think introducing invasive species intentionally or accidentally is generally of any benefit. It's almost always a detriment. In the 70s, African antelopes called gemsbok were introduced to the White Sands region for the purpose of trophy hunting. So there are African ungulates living in the American desert. And they're still there. Like I Googled it a couple months ago, and I think their population is somewhere between like 1,500, I want to say. And not only are there gemsbok, but there are Barbary sheep called oudads from northern Africa. And these are like those really classic looking mountain goats. There's a passage in here where Ellen writes about the pronghorn, which are North American antelopes, and they're the second fastest land creature on the planet, just behind the cheetah. And their whole history is interesting, like beside the point, because they evolved the ability to run so fast to get away from like saber-toothed cats, which are now extinct. So these antelope were just really fast. And she writes in here that there's sort of like I guess it's a little bit like a myth, or I don't want to call it a rumor. What do you call that? Like a folk story, that after the Trinity test, pronghorn were never seen in the area again. The implication being that they were killed in the explosion of the bomb. She also writes of this test during the Trinity explosion, where mice were hung at different intervals by their tail on stakes to see how they would respond to the detonation. And some of them, like, they died of dehydration because they're just like being pounded on by the desert sun. Animal testing was also mentioned in Atomic Doctors, where like goats, guinea pigs, sheep, rats, rabbits, beagles specifically were put on army ships in the Marshall Islands that were hit by the atomic tests, and like some of these animals were half dead, and like their skin was falling off, and they were like respiring crazy. Just these really horrible scenes. God, I love El Meloy. I need to get out to the desert. That Colorado trip was the furthest west I have ever gone. And me and my friend were gonna actually drive to Utah to go to Dinosaur National Monument, but I was only there for the weekend and driving like 7 hours through the desert, and then 7 hours back, because I don't expect her to like drive back alone all that distance. Like it just wasn't feasible. But at some point I'll get out to the desert, and in the meantime I will continue reading Ellen Meloy to experience it. Thank you all for spending your time viewing my pixels. I really encourage you to please read the work of Miss Ellen Meloy. She means so much to me. And I leave you with this. If no one tells you what happened here, nothing in the desert itself would give it away. The land appears to have no meaning beyond that which I bring to it with my own knowledge. Yet, if who I am is geography as well as blood, if living where I do matters, then this place too is blood and home.